I'm Jerry Grover, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Jerry Grover back on the show. He's been working on a translation of the Caracters Document. It's going to be a fun conversation. We'll talk about the language of Reformed Egyptian. Is it hieratic, demonic, or some other form, or a combination? We'll also talk a little bit about the golden plates. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Welcome back to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a return visitor, Jerry Grover. So for those people who don't remember, can you want to give us a little brief introduction from our first interview?
Just my background a little bit? Yeah. I'm licensed structural civil engineer, licensed professional geologist. I also have worked doing translating, freelance. I've written a variety of books, primarily related to the Book of Mormon or topics closely related to the Book of Mormon. Yeah, we talked about geology in the Book of Mormon last time. Right. And so that's kind of, my interface, at least the reason I, engaged in Mormon studies is basically Book of Mormon. So that's kind of my area, I would say, of expertise. From Utah, born in Hawaii, but moved at a young age to Utah. Father, professor at BYU, 15 kids in the family, kind of Your father had 15 kids? Well, it's kind of yours, mine, theirs. Oh, okay. My mother died when I was like 6. Okay. He remarried, and then they had more. So. Wow. So, but I guess heritage, nobody cares that much. But my father, my great-great-grandfather's in the Doctrine and Covenants, Thomas Grover. So kind of pioneer heritage on that side. My mother was a convert. So, but mostly grew up in Utah. Served a mission in Sicily, southern Italy. Did you make it to Pompeii? We never asked you that last time. That was actually outside my mission, so I would have gotten sent home had I done that. But I've been there many times. I'm actually a dual Italian-American citizen. Oh, wow. Yeah, just by marriage. I want to go to Pompeii in the worst way. Yeah, Herculaneum's also. I've been to Rome. Rome was awesome. Yeah, Herculaneum, actually, that's where you can actually see the casts of the bodies that were. Oh, really? Yeah, that's a little town not too far from Pompeii. From Pompeii, yeah. It's kind of the port. That's where they all went when the volcano erupted. They went there to get on the ships and didn't make it. So. Very cool, very cool. So, yeah, that's a little bit of my background. And so tell us about some of your other books that you've written. We're here to talk about a certain one about characters, but what are the other ones before we get into characters? Yeah, I wrote one on, it's called Ziph, Magic Goggles and Golden Plates, that basically looked at the etymology of the word Ziph, what it meant, and then I also looked at the metallurgy, describing the plates and how they were made and what the techniques were, and that was a book dedicated to that. I wrote a book called Swords of Shul, where I looked at the chronology of the Jaredites, also looked at the cultural practices. They correlate to the Olmec. So I looked at the cultural practice of the Olmec, such as burying weapons. Like the Anti-Nephi eyes. Yeah, exactly. At the time of the king, which correlates. I looked at, the chronology in great detail and the geography of the land northward in relation to the Jaredites and the correlation archaeologically with the Olmec and the Jaredite. And looked at metals, what the metals they're talking about were. There's a lot kind of miscellaneous things in that, all related to land northward Jaredite issues. I wrote a big, huge book, like 800 pages or something. 800? Yeah, it's basically Sumerian etymology of Jaredite names. So I was trying to, because that was one thing nobody had made any progress on in terms of names, where they came from. The Jaredite have just kind of resisted all the people trying to figure out what they are and what they mean. So I took a stab at that and kind of went through. So I went through all the names in the Book of Mormon, place names or unknown words, and kind of showed how at least the Jaredite ones look to have Sumerian etymology. I think I've heard Pehorin, isn't that one an Egyptian word? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but actually what I found is many of them have meanings in multiple. So they have meanings in Hebrew, they have an underlying glyph form or Egyptian, and then also can have meaning in Sumerian if constructed in a Mesoamerican fashion, the name. So they're doing a very sophisticated, they're trying to get as much meaning into the name as they can. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that was a big, long book, which I don't know too many people have read it, but I actually get a lot of comments. People.
I was going to say all your books are long, except for it seems like you do like to include lots of pictures, and so sometimes you can fly through those pages if you skip the pictures.
Yeah, that's right.
Not saying I did that.
Just to keep you. Well, one of the things I get is I always get, these would be from critics, right? So, was your heart, will my heart burn when I read your books? And I said, well, your eyes will. and nobody cries reading. Maybe my books are not emotional or anything. They're very dry because it's science. It's not. I'm not trying to pretend. It's
we are the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology.
That's right, and they're free, like I said. So
and tell us where you can get them.
It's www.bmslr, stands for Book of Mormon Science and Linguistic Research.org.com. I mean, I've got a lot of, and they're all there for free download in PDF form.
Yeah,
and so
your geology book's going for $80.
Well, what I do is because the premise here is I do a limited printing for hard copies. I'm not in the book selling business.
Right.
So like the geology, I think I printed like 700, donated a lot to libraries, that kind of thing. And there were some people that wanted hard copies, so I sold them, but I didn't do a second printing or anything like that. And actually the website one is a little more accurate because I corrected.
You can update stuff.
I corrected typos. Yeah, I mean, I don't care. I use professional editors like everybody else. Sometimes twice, but they still make it through the typos.
Right.
So probably some of the books maybe more just because there wasn't a lot printed. It's not by design. It's just because because it's available for free electronically. There wasn't really a huge demand for the print, and I just sell them. I sold them at cost, so it wasn't a profit center.
Well, you were nice enough to give me a copy of the Characters book. Why don't you show that to our audience and tell us?
This is the update, revised and update. I did an earlier one, and then I expanded it a little bit.
So you've translated the Characters document. That led to Steve Shields making you an entry in his Divergent Paths of the Restoration. And
I wasn't aware of any path I was on, but that's okay. Divergent or otherwise. I just thought it was interesting, so I wrote a book.
So you're not a prophet or anything?
No, I wrote that in the introduction. I don't know if you've read it, but it basically it says something like, which unfortunately sometimes I have kind of a sarcastic sense of humor, but I think I was actually in the first one I wrote. It was something to the effect like, no, a sandy-haired angel didn't appear to me. No, I'm not starting a church. Let me put this out there right at the beginning. So it's just an interesting area that I looked at and actually, I think I made progress.
So you're not a Denver snuffer or anything like that?
No, he hasn't approached me or anything. So I'm just kind of a run-of-the-mill. I'm not a bishop or anything. I'm just a... kind of under that.
Just an engineer and geologist, huh?
Yeah, like I did say, I'm very credible because I'm an ex-politician. I restore vintage cars, so I'm a used car salesman. And I currently work for a developer, so I'm totally credible.
All right. Well, let's jump into the Characters document. What is and why is it misspelled Characters, by the way? Can you tell us, for those people who've never heard of it, what is the Characters document?
Well, for a long time, people called it the Anthon transcript.
Right.
But the Anthon transcript, the description didn't really match what the Characters document had because they talked about an emblem similar to the Mexican zodiac. That's Anthon. When he talked about it, he wrote, I guess there were 3 letters. I mean, they found one more recently. And it talked about stars and moons and 4 lines of text. It doesn't match the Characters document. So it's clear there, and there was actually an article, I think, by McKay that actually dealt with the provenance. They did handwriting analysis the extent they could on the characters. And so it looks like John Whitmer's handwriting, so it clearly wasn't, the Anthon transcript.
Right.
And so and it came up through the David Whitmer family and then the RLDS and Community Church of Christ.
Well, and Mark Hoffman actually created an Anthon document.
He did, yeah.
That matched the historical description quite well, sold it to the church for a lot of money. I will tell you, maybe if I can find it, I have a picture. Robin Jensen from the Church History Library showed us the iron mark where Hoffman had tried to age it, and he'd use an iron. You can see the
little.
Yeah,
I don't like the book. I don't really get into all of that. I just say, okay, here's where it came from.
But yeah, this is a different document.
Yeah, and there's actually some examples. There's actually a broadside in New York newspaper, The Prophet. It was LDS. It was a Mormon, publication that. It was kind of like an advertisement. Come see these, the Book of Mormon that has the Reformed Egyptian. And they used the first lines of the Characters Document. It's actually in this book, I kind of show the comparison of those glyphs. And they actually had the Characters Document, it's kind of worn off on one edge. It's like water. And that broadside actually had a few additional characters, which I included, on the edge.
Oh, nice.
And you can kind of see them if you look close.
So you've updated it. That's good.
Yeah, and so I actually had that in the original, but I've kind of said, listen, if you're going to go try to do a translation, you need the complete text, right? So, and so that was a little later, I think 1847 or something like that. But McKay talks about that and the provenance.
Who's the first name? Michael McKay?
Michael McKay has an article. You can find it online. I think I even have it on my academia page, just loaded up there so people can read it. But it basically talks about there probably were multiple copies of, in the Characters Document, there's actually a picture in 1887 that shows additional paper here, and it has some writing, something about Abraham anyway. So, and it was folded. And I think what they think is they actually kind of like use this as like a missionary tool. Oh. So they go out and say, yeah, here's they copy the characters and then show them, just like they did on the broadside as kind of this ad to get people interested in the church. So it does, everything is indicating that it was copied from the plates. So, and, it went through the Whitmer family, so it has pretty good provenance back to the time of Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith did say he copied characters and translated some of them. And there's actually, I did include here, there are actually 4 characters that we have. Frederick G. Williams has them. There's a document that the church has. And it's the same place where the Lehi landed in Chile thing comes from that Frederick G. Williams wrote. But there's actually, he actually lists the 4 characters, Book of Mormon, interpreters of language. And then they have a scrap of paper with Oliver Cowdery's handwriting with the same thing. So probably Frederick G. Williams, we're thinking maybe he copied that from Oliver Cowdery, was making kind of a compilation, I'm thinking, perhaps. Kind of the theory, Don Bradley batted it around that maybe Frederick G. Williams, those are things Oliver Cowdery was collecting because he was anticipating translating or something. Because they all kind of have to deal with, there was like one of the early versions of one of the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Parchment of John, that dealt with that, kind of when they both looked at the Urim and Thummim. It says Oliver and Joseph, and then there's kind of some strange Hebrew-y thing that's correlating to one of the verses in Jacob, and then these 4 glyphs. So anyway, so we do have, and I included and looked at those and said, were those translations correct? Can you find those in Hieratic, Egyptian, or Demotic? And yeah, you can, with the translations that Joseph rendered. So you're saying that this is translatable? It's not just a bunch of random characters, because isn't that what Charles Anthon said was these are just some random... Right, but he wasn't necessarily looking at this, and he wouldn't have known Hieratic Egyptian anyway.
He wouldn't have?
No, it came out. It was probably available, I guess, but he wasn't an expert in that, as far as I know.
So Reformed Egyptian is Hieratic?
Well, Reformed Egyptian is the name that is referred to by Mormon and Moroni. Okay. It's in the Book of Mormon. They called it that. It's not It's not like there's some Reformed Egyptian. They just basically said it's modified Egyptian, and so they knew the original. Like Nephi said, he wrote in Egyptian, so it actually changed through the years, which you would expect from any language, right? Try reading Beowulf, I can't understand.
I know.
Right.
So that's not even English, I swear. It's like, I know it's technically English, but it's like so hard to read.
Yeah. So what I did is, the curious thing, I I wrote this book was writing Ziph, actually, and ended up publishing that later, but I'd kind of figured out the number of plates that there were I did some experimentation, because Emma said you could rustle them like parchment. So
and that's a good anti-Mormon point, is because I know I've been to Sandra Tanner's house, and she has a.
So I shouldn't be talking to you anymore.
Well, she has a facsimile that's made out of lead, and lead is supposed to be less heavy than gold. And she's like, "Here, pick this up," and it's really heavy. Yeah. And so a lot of critics will say, "Those." There's no way
Joseph could run through the forest and broke his thumb or whatever.
Right, because it's heavy. And so Ziph is a lighter form of gold, or
no. What I did is I didn't assume Ziph anything. I looked for the meaning of Ziph just because I was curious. And again, I worked at a metallurgy business that was involved in metals and smelting metals, and so that word interested me. I was like, what the heck is that?
Right.
And so, but what I did is I did kind of the research on Ziph, but associated with that, I also looked at the plates, because it was just, again, because people are saying these kinds of things like they're lead or whatever. And so I said,
and Dan Vogel has said he thinks that Joseph fashioned them out of tin.
Yep, right. So, but I just took the original, Emma, she didn't see them, at least as far as we know, but she handled them. And then she mentioned that they rustle like parchment, or you could hear rustling, and I think
so they were very
a similar statement was made maybe by somebody else. So I said, okay, let's see if I can figure out the thickness of the plates based on that. So I actually...
John Pratt said because supposedly they're in Brazil now, right? But he said
not the ones I looked at, but...
He said they were like...
Not the one the angel gave to me.
He said the Brazil plates are like 14 karat gold, so they wouldn't be pure gold.
Yeah. Well, and you have to look at it and say, okay, you can either... They were never described as gold. They were always saying golden, of ancient make or whatever. Nobody... I think there was one, like a newspaper... gold, but it wasn't like an original.
Gold Bible.
Yeah, right. But it wasn't like the original people saying that they were gold. And how would they have known pure gold or not? I don't know. They weren't metallurgists. Joe Smith probably, who knows? But I just said, okay, well, let's see what they describe. Okay, and see whether we figure out what they are. What is the alloy mix? So basically I said, first of all, I know the roughly dimensions, 6 by 8. There's a few different descriptions. Weight, 40 to 60 pounds. They were described somewhere. Nobody weighed them on a scale. They just were estimating. So I said, okay, at least I have some parameters. And then, so I actually got specially made copper. I didn't use gold initially, too expensive, but that would match the modulus of elasticity, the hardness of what you would expect ancient cold work metal to be. And then I took those, and then I actually just did tests to see what thickness you could get rustling, and some, you could get it very thin, but it's too thin to engrave on, right? So you had a range. So I actually figured out a pretty reasonable range for the thickness of the plates based on that, and they were described as tin, and actually as thick as window glass, and so I looked at that, but those were just kind of. They weren't very scientific. They were just commenting.
Right.
But anyway, so I kind of knew the thickness. And then the question is, okay, and the other thing is like, I'm sure Sandra Tanner, did she have the plates just stacked on top of each other, probably just from cut lead or something like that with no space in between the individual plates?
Well, they had individual leaves, so you could... she said be careful because they're, it's kind of fragile, but the rings were fragile.
But were they just perfectly flat against each other?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's not how you would expect. If it's ancient work, that's rolled in a mill. That's the way that metal was generated. So the question is, okay, so you actually, because you have deflection, right? The plates, if it's cold work, they're not going to be completely flat. anciently. They didn't really have that technology. And so then the question is, so then I just says, okay, what was done? And we do have metal work from South America and other polished plates. And so I kind of figured, and there's articles on what the roughness is of that and the deflection. So I was like, okay, if you stack them, there's a certain amount of void between each plate, right?
So you're saying there should be air in between each plate?
Yeah, because they don't, not air, not like a floating air. But,
no, I understand.
But when they go to get their rough, so there is air pocket. I mean, they don't.
Right.
I mean, obviously, if it's a large plate stack, it'll smush some.
We're not stamping plates like we would with a modern process.
Yeah, exactly. Rolling it with a roller.
Right.
So they're hammering, they're doing other things. And then
So it's not going to be perfectly fine.
Yeah, so I actually looked at different highly polished, roughly polished, so I said there's a range. So I says, so consider that. Then the question was, okay, so I kind of have a rough, what the plate stack kind of was, and how many roughly plates you would expect in that high of a stack. So then the question is, okay, we have these other parameters. We have a weight, dimensions, and then I have surface area because I have I have plates and I know the surface area, those dimensions. So on both sides. So then the question is, okay, that answers a little bit. By doing that experimentation, I got a number of plates. Then the question is, okay, how did they actually make these things? Because, and Nephi indicated he used, there's a chapter break there which shouldn't be there, and where he says they came and he found ores of copper, gold, and silver, and then he made the plate. Then there's a chapter break, and then the next verse is he made the plate. So he's actually, looks like he's saying that they were made of some sort of copper, gold, silver alloy. The other thing is silver and gold. Gold almost always occurs if it's native gold, right, not smelted, which they weren't doing, it actually has some silver in it. And the technology to separate that silver out, like completely out, didn't really exist at the time Lehi left Jerusalem. It was
even in the old world.
Yeah, right. It was a little later with the Greeks. But there was a technique that they did use to get a gold surface. And what they did is called depletion gilding. And it's found like in the Leiden papyri, and there's actually examples of it in Egyptian museums, the British Museum, of where they found this type of process that was used to create a gold surface. And they basically use some sort of reactant, typically like a plant acid, and they'll lay it on the surface, and heat it, and they will get let's say it's a copper, silver, gold alloy. It could just be gold, silver. The gold will not react because the gold it's difficult to get gold to oxidize, except at super high pH. It doesn't really oxidize in environments that we have in nature. That's why it doesn't get tarnished, right?
Right.
And so, but silver and copper clearly will. Copper will go green and silver will go black. And so they get those to oxidize with the acid, and then they burnish them, heat that, and burnish it, rub it really hard, and they can get those metals out of the surface. And so when they do it enough, they get left with about a 10 micron deep thickness of gold on the surface. This is called depletion gilding. They also found the Colombian Indians, when the pre-conquest, were using this same technique. And that's what's typically known as timbaga. It's a form of timbaga. Timbaga is just a copper, silver, gold alloy. And in fact, the Spanish thought it was gold. And yeah, they took a lot of it hauled it all back to Spain and melted it. Got pretty angry because it was mostly copper.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
El Dorado?
Right. So it's not that they didn't have some more gold, but it was, it was pretty common. And it's not really, it's not used now. It's not a technique used now because it's not an efficient way to use gold, because you're still leaving gold. Let's say you have gold in the alloy. You're only getting the gold on the surface. The gold is still trapped in the alloy, and the rest in the base metal, the base part. You wouldn't.
And so should we be calling these the copper plates instead of the gold plates?
Well, they were called golden.
Yeah.
So,
Because copper's a lot lighter.
Yeah. And so what I did is I said, okay, so that looks like the technique. The other thing was the characters themselves, the engraving characters themselves, are described as black with a stain or cement in them. And so, which makes sense because what you have is you have a very thin layer of gold. When they engrave, they get through that layer, right? Now they're into the base metal. And so they had to use some sort of patina or protective way so that those engravings weren't subject to corrosion, because you're now exposing the underlying copper and maybe a little bit of silver. And it was kind of interesting because there was a fellow that just did all these experiments with depletion guild, not LDS, not anything related, no religion. He was just curious. And so he did all these scratching and actually created this, in all the engraving, created this black patina, basically oxidized copper that then would protect the engravings themselves. It also gives, kind of this contrast of gold and black. And,
makes it easier to read.
Right. And, who knows, maybe it had some religious significance of the shiny and I don't know. But so, so I basically explained, that looks like the techniques is pretty straightforward. And then I basically said, okay, since we know the weight, I know the dimensions, I know the surface area, I know the thickness of, at least of the gold. And so I just kind of iteratively figured out probably the range of gold content. So it looks like 4 to 8 karat is what the alloy was.
4 to 8 carats of gold.
Yeah. So it was. And
the rest was copper.
And some, like I said, there's some range because you'd have silver and copper. You may have different. You can use different amounts with the gold to arrive at the same weight. So it's a range is what we did.
Well, the copper would be lighter than the silver, right?
Yeah, I think it is slightly. I have to look at. I haven't looked at the book, but yeah, and so the question is, and there was some evidence because I think Josiah Stoll when he saw a corner of probably the sealed portion of the plates when it was being handed through the window, and he said they had like a greenish cast to it, and then. Like
which would indicate copper.
Yeah, and then William said they thought they were copper. So how would he? Probably the only way he would know is some green coloration, right? Which you would expect if they had 99.9% had done the depletion gilding, got most of it out, but maybe there was just a little traces of copper still, a few molecules that you may have like a little greenish to it. So it's consistent with the technology that you would have expected that they used to create the plates. Then the other thing I did is I said, okay, I've got these alloy mixes. How does it work? How will they? Because it's it's three metals, so they behave differently. And in working, the gold working, there's actually like they call them ternary diagrams that show the alloy, what you can work and what you can of different concentrations of copper, gold, and silver. And it actually falls in the concentration where they're workable. I mean, it's not too brittle to work. So it was consistent with the ancient metallurgy, what they would have been able to work and make plates out of.
This is something that they would have used in Israel? Can we say that?
Well, what I'm saying, I don't know if there's found examples in Israel. I'm saying they've found examples in Egypt.
I know with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have the copper scroll, but it was curled up almost in like a can. It was very round. I mean, yeah. Like they rolled it up.
And see, Nephi doesn't really talk. All he talks about is the brass plates. Then he gets to New World. Then he creates these other plates.
Right.
He obviously knew the technology.
Well, we don't really have evidence of.
And they brought gold and silver with them. They were probably had. It's been supposed, and rightly so, that Lehi and Nephi they knew metalworking. They were because they went back to get their gold and silver. I mean, most people just don't have that sitting around in the ancient ways. So and they went south where. They were in the southern part. That's where the mines were that generated gold and silver in Israel. So they were maybe even familiar with the area. They went south to the Red Sea. The mines are down there. So, maybe they traded down there. May have been familiar with the trade route that he followed. I'm just saying it. So I would, and he knew how to work iron.
Right.
So he obviously, so he probably knew the technique. Whether there were plates or records made of them, I'm not saying
we don't have any record of really plates in the Old World or in the New World, right?
Well, we have the Darius plate. There were in the Persia. There was a gold plate with
Oh, just one plate, not like...
Yeah, just one plate, but it was in a stone box and it had 3 different languages. It was dedicatory, I think, part of a temple that was found. So, I mean, it had writing on it. So, I mean, it was known as a medium that they could engrave on, let's put it that way, whether there was some practice of record keeping. And of course, the brass plates, they were probably, metal was not just this easily acquired thing, meaning it had a lot of value. That's one reason you don't find always tons of it in archaeological digs, because people would reuse it. And so, again, I didn't really look at this as part of my book or anything, but you have the brass plates that kept them, pretty secured. It wasn't like everybody, we got our version of the brass plates. It was a pretty rare item. So, but the question is, I wasn't saying whether they were all found. I was looking at the technology and what. Yes, the technology existed to make these things, and it was known that they knew how to make that kind of stuff, and especially in the New World, they had it. So that was kind of the premise of looking at that, was trying to figure out, again, these kind
What were the golden plates made of?
Yeah, really. Just, again, it's like, does anyone care? No, I don't know, but I was interested. The tanners care, I suppose. Don Vogel maybe cares, I don't know. And so, that's why I wrote a book, and then...
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jerry Grover. In our next conversation, we're going to actually dive into the translation and find out more about the language that the Characters Document was written in.
So you have the monumental, which is on the temple. That's not what they used for business or normal practices. Or most of the papyri are not monumental Egyptian. They're hieratic. And then Demotic came in 700, 650 BC. Demotic is another shorthand form of. They're shorthand forms of the monumental Egyptian, basically.
Thanks for listening to Gospel Tangents. If you'd like to support me, please subscribe at gospeltangents.com. or on patreon.com/gospeltangents, or you can watch entire videos at youtube.com/gospeltangents. I really can't do this without your support. I'd love to do it full time, and I need a lot more people that are willing to help me out. So I'd really appreciate that. So thanks again for listening, and don't forget to check out some of our other videos.